The history of financial fraud is long, embarrassing, and shockingly repetitive. Hundreds of billions stolen using essentially the same trick with a fresh coat of paint each time. So today, we're breaking down every major pyramid scheme in history, how they worked, and why people kept falling for them. Starting with the man who was so good at scamming, they literally named the crime after him: Charles Ponzi. In 1920, a relatively unremarkable Italian immigrant named Charles Ponzi stumbled onto what might be the most influential financial crime in history. Not because it was sophisticated, it really wasn't, but because every scammer for the next century would basically copy his homework. Here's the pitch. Ponzi told investors he could exploit price differences in international postal reply coupons to generate returns of 50% in 45 days or 100% in 90 days, which is, not how anything works, but people didn't care. At his peak, Ponzi was pulling in $250,000 a day from roughly 40,000 investors, accumulating around $15 million total. That's approximately $230 million today. People literally camped outside his office begging to hand him their life savings. "Please, sir, take my money." Well, if you insist. The whole thing lasted exactly 8 months. The Boston Post published an investigation that brought the entire operation crashing down. Ponzi was arrested, and he was eventually deported to Italy. He died broke. 8 months of work, an eternity of name recognition. Every financial scam that uses new investor money to pay old investors is now called a Ponzi scheme. The man accidentally became the mascot for fraud, and his scheme wasn't even that impressive compared to what came next. Because if Ponzi used fake coupons, the next guy on our list used something even more ridiculous: salad oil. The Great Salad Oil Swindle. Between 1960 and 1963, a man named Tino De Angelis managed to sell $175 million worth of salad oil that didn't exist. And I mean literally didn't exist. He ran a storage facility in New Jersey filled with massive tanks that were supposed to contain vegetable oil. They did not. They contained water. Here's the thing: oil floats on water. That's it. That's the entire scheme. De Angelis filled his tanks with water and poured a thin layer of oil on top, so when inspectors came by and physically dipped their hands in to check, they touched oil. Inspection passed. Billions of dollars in futures contracts validated, because nobody thought to check more than 2 inches deep. But the real victim here is American Express. One of the most trusted financial brands on the planet looked at these tanks full of water, said, "Yep, that's oil," and certified their existence. When the whole thing collapsed on November 19th, 1963, American Express lost approximately $58 million. That was their entire annual profit. Gone, because oil floats on water. Something you learn in 3rd grade science class. De Angelis got sentenced to 10 years in prison, served about 5, and the collapse triggered a full-blown commodity exchange crisis that forced regulators to completely overhaul how futures trading and warehouse inspections work. All because a guy in New Jersey exploited something a rubber duck could have told you. But if you think defrauding people with fake commodities is embarrassing, wait until you hear about the scheme that used fake wine. Restored Classics. Here's a fun one. In the late 2000s and 10s, a wine investment scheme called Bordeaux Cellars emerged, promising wealthy investors massive returns on rare wine collections. The pitch was simple. You hand over your money, they buy exquisite vintage bottles on your behalf, store them in professional facilities, and watch the value climb. Elegant, sophisticated, and completely made up. The bottles didn't exist. The storage facilities were either empty or filled with garbage. The certificates of authenticity were fabricated. Over just a couple years, this scheme drained investors of more than $100 million, all for wine that was never purchased, never stored, and never real. But here's where it gets genuinely funny. Wine fraud in general has produced some absolutely incredible moments of incompetence. Counterfeiters have been caught stuffing cheap bulk wine into fake bottles of legendary vintages, complete with labels that had spelling errors on them. That's like forging a Picasso and signing it Paciso. You had one job, and somehow with Bordeaux Cellars, nobody checked for years. These were wealthy, educated investors handing over fortunes for bottles that physically did not exist, stored in warehouses nobody visited. The scheme ran from roughly 2017 until authorities finally caught up around 2019, resulting in charges and lawsuits. The whole disaster became one of the largest wine fraud cases in modern history, which really says something about how little oversight the wine investment world actually has. The best part? Wine fraud schemes keep coming back using the exact same playbook, decade after decade. Turns out rich people will always fall for a good bottle with a fancy label, even if neither one is real. But if a fake wine scheme sounds quaint, wait until you hear about the pyramid scheme that consumed an entire country's economy overnight. In January 1994, a man named Sergei Mavrodi launched an investment club in Russia that promised 3,000% annual returns. And roughly 10 to 15 million Russians said, yeah, that sounds about right, which is, not ideal. Wasn't just a pyramid scheme. It was a cultural event. Mavrodi's face appeared on more billboards across Moscow than any sitting politician. There were TV commercials, there was merchandise. The whole thing was branded like a patriotic institution, like investing in MMM was investing in Russia itself. People didn't just hand over their savings. They did it with pride. Here's where it gets dark. This was post-Soviet Russia. The economy was already in freefall. People had nothing, and Mavrodi walked in wearing a suit and said, "Give me what little you have left, and I'll multiply it by 30. So they did. Millions of them. The scheme collapsed in August 1994. Barely 7 months after launch, Mavrodi vanished. Life savings gone. Retirement funds gone. Everything ordinary people had scraped together during one of the most chaotic economic periods in modern history just evaporated. But here's the part that genuinely broke my brain during research. Many of those victims still believe they'll get paid back 30 years later. Still waiting. Still defending the man who robbed them. It's less like a financial scam and more like a religion at that point. And Mavrodi, he didn't stop. He relaunched MMM in different countries, multiple times, using the exact same playbook. New country, same promise, same result. Hello, I'm the guy who stole billions. Would you also like to participate? And people said yes. I don't know what to tell you, but if MMM sounds like a national tragedy, wait until you hear about the Romanian version, which somehow managed to end even worse. Caritas. If MMM proved that post-communist Russia was a financial predator's playground, Romania said, hold my beer. Caritas launched in 1992 as a pyramid scheme, so brazen it barely even pretended to be anything else. The pitch was simple. Invest your money, recruit your friends, and receive 8-fold returns within months. 8 times your money, just like that. And people bought it. Hundreds of thousands of them. By its peak, somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 Romanians had thrown their savings into Caritas. The total capital flowing through the scheme was enormous, potentially representing a significant chunk of Romania's entire GDP at the time. In a country still reeling from decades of communist economic control, where the average person had zero experience with free markets or investment, those numbers are staggering. These weren't wealthy speculators. These were ordinary families betting everything on a promise that was mathematically impossible. Then August 1994 hit and the whole thing imploded. Payments stopped. The scheme simply couldn't sustain itself any longer. Financial panic spread across the country, but here's where Caritas separates itself from every other scheme on this list. The fallout wasn't just economic, it was deeply political. The scheme had been openly endorsed by the mayor of Cluj-Napoca, Romania's second largest city. Local politicians had used Caritas as a populist tool, tying their credibility directly to its success. When it collapsed, public trust in Romanian institutions cratered even further than it already had. That's not a normal Tuesday for financial fraud. And the wildest part? Some victims still believe 30 years later that Caritas was working, that the system was deliberately undermined to crush a legitimate financial alternative, not because it was a mathematically inevitable collapse, but because the elites were scared. That conspiracy theory remains politically contentious in Romania to this day, which is, not ideal, but at least Caritas only destroyed a national economy. The next guy on our list destroyed boy bands, Lou Pearlman. The man who created the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC was simultaneously running a $300 million Ponzi scheme. And honestly, that sentence alone is probably the wildest thing I've said in this entire video. Here's how it worked. Lou Pearlman was a music promoter who founded Transcontinental Records and managed some of the biggest pop acts on the planet. We're talking Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, groups that sold tens of millions of albums and were printing money faster than the US Mint. So when Pearlman told investors they could get in on the action by investing in his music company, people lined up. Celebrities, sports figures, regular people who just wanted a piece of the boy band gold mine. And why wouldn't they? The bands were real, the concerts were real, the revenue was real, but the investor returns were not. Perlman was sending out completely fabricated statements showing profits that didn't exist, using fresh investor money and legitimate boy band revenue to pay earlier investors. The genius of this scheme, and I use that word reluctantly, is that the boy bands were so wildly successful that nobody had any reason to question the numbers. You're looking at your statement going, yeah, 15% return sounds about right. NSYNC just sold out Madison Square Garden. The real success made the fake success invisible. This went on for over a decade, from roughly 1995 to 2006. Perlman kept the whole thing spinning. It finally collapsed when banks demanded collateral he couldn't produce, which is, not ideal when your entire financial empire is built on vibes and fabricated spreadsheets. He was arrested in June 2007, sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, and died behind bars in August 2016 at 62 years old. The man literally weaponized boy bands. I don't know what to tell you, but if Perlman's $300 million sounds like a lot of money, the next guy on this list makes him look like he was running a lemonade stand. Bernie Madoff. Every scheme we've talked about so far has been impressive in its own horrible way, but none of them come close to this one, not even in the same zip code. Bernie Madoff ran the largest Ponzi scheme in human history. $65 billion, 4,800 clients, 48 years of operation. And here's the thing. He wasn't some outsider running a shady operation out of a strip mall. His firm was one of the largest market makers on NASDAQ. He was a respected, trusted, borderline celebrated figure in the financial industry. People didn't invest with Madoff because they were gullible. They invested with him because he was, by every measurable standard, one of the most legitimate people in the room, which makes the next part so much worse. The SEC visited his office multiple times, found nothing. An independent investigator named Harry Markopolos spent years, literal years, raising red flags about Madoff's returns. He submitted detailed mathematical proof that the numbers were impossible. The SEC's response was essentially, yeah, we'll look into it, and then they didn't. Markopolos later described the experience as screaming into a void, which is, not ideal when billions of dollars are on the line. The scheme finally collapsed on December 11th, 2008, right in the middle of the financial crisis, when Madoff confessed to his own sons that the entire thing was a fraud. They reported him. He was arrested the next day, sentenced to 150 years in prison on June 29, 2009, died behind bars on April 14, 2021, at 82 years old. But the real legacy isn't Madoff himself. It's the fact that the system designed to catch people like him completely failed for nearly 5 decades. The collapse directly contributed to the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, which was basically Congress admitting, yeah, our oversight was a disaster, here's 2,300 pages of new rules. Great, add that to the list. And if you think $65 billion is the ceiling for financial fraud committed by guys who love sports, wait until you hear about the cricket tycoon, Allen Stanford. So here's a fun question. What do you do when you're running a $7 billion fraud and you need people to think you're legitimate? Apparently, you sponsor an entire sport. Allen Stanford, a Texas financier with a name that sounds like a prep school nobody asked for, decided that the best way to keep his Ponzi scheme running was to become the biggest name in international cricket. And honestly, it worked for 11 years. Stanford International Bank, based in Antigua, which already sounds like a place you'd set a Bond villain's headquarters, promised investors guaranteed returns of 8 to 15% annually. The money was supposedly going into diversified international portfolios, sophisticated stuff, the kind of thing that sounds boring enough to be real. But here's the thing. The monthly statements investors received contained completely fictitious portfolio holdings. Every single line item was made up. The portfolios didn't exist, the investments didn't exist, the returns didn't exist. Approximately 28,000 people were reading financial fan fiction every month and didn't know it. Now, most fraudsters try to stay quiet, keep a low profile, not Stanford. This man spent hundreds of millions of dollars sponsoring cricket tournaments, including the Stanford 2020 with a $20 million winner-take-all purse. He literally had a glass case filled with $20 million in cash carried onto the pitch, just sitting there on a cricket field, as you do. The cricket wasn't a hobby, it was a legitimacy machine. You see a man handing out $20 million on live television, and your brain goes, yeah, that guy's probably good for my retirement fund. He also hired expensive auditing firms and regulatory advisors specifically to make everything look airtight. Layers upon layers of credibility, all of it hollow. Stanford got arrested on June 18, 2009, just months after Madoff's collapse, which meant almost nobody paid attention. The $65 billion guy sucked all the oxygen out of the room, but Stanford was convicted on 13 of 14 criminal counts, including wire fraud and money laundering, and received 110 years in federal prison, which is, a lot of years. But if Stanford used cricket to hide his fraud, the next entry on this list used something even more creative, an entirely fake cryptocurrency. OneCoin. In 2014, a Bulgarian woman named Ruja Ignatova launched what she called the future of cryptocurrency. She had a PhD in law, wore designer gowns to her own events, and spoke to stadiums full of investors like she was headlining Coachella. The whole thing radiated legitimacy, and every single piece of it was fake. OneCoin was marketed as a revolutionary cryptocurrency that would overtake Bitcoin. There were educational packages you could buy, ranging from $100 up to $500,000, each coming with tokens that would supposedly convert into OneCoin at massive returns. The branding was professional. The recruitment structure was textbook multi-level marketing, and the cryptocurrency itself had no blockchain. Zero. None. The coin was just a number on a screen that Ignatova's team controlled manually. You weren't investing in crypto. You were buying a fictional number from a woman in a red dress. Between 2014 and 2017, OneCoin pulled in somewhere between $4 and $15 billion globally. That's a wild range, but that's what happens when your fraud spans dozens of countries. Investors from Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas all bought in. Entire communities were gutted. Then, on October 25, 2017, Ruja Ignatova boarded a flight from Sofia to Athens and vanished. Not metaphorically, she literally disappeared. She remains on Interpol's red notice as one of the most wanted fugitives on the planet. Her brother Konstantin pleaded guilty and cooperated with authorities. Multiple associates have been convicted, but Ruja, gone, which is, not ideal for the billions of dollars worth of victims waiting for answers. Here's the truly unhinged part. The scheme kept running after she disappeared. New leadership stepped in and kept accepting money. And Ignatova became something of an internet celebrity, with podcasts, documentaries, and entire social media accounts dedicated to tracking her down like she's some glamorous mystery, rather than a woman who stole billions and ghosted an entire planet. She built a fake coin with no technology, sold it to millions, and then pulled off the one thing crypto bros have been promising for years. She actually went fully decentralized, from herself. But if you thought OneCoin was the most embarrassing thing to happen to cryptocurrency, allow me to introduce you to a platform that made grown men scream at a camera: BitConnect. In January 2017, a cryptocurrency lending platform promised users roughly 1% daily interest on their Bitcoin deposits. That works out to over 3,000% annualized returns, which, if you've been paying attention to literally anything in this video, should immediately make your skin crawl. But millions of people didn't flinch. BitConnect's pitch was simple. You deposit Bitcoin, their proprietary trading bot generates insane returns, and you get paid daily. No explanation of how the bot worked. No transparency into the trades. Just trust us, here's your money. And for a while, the money actually showed up, because that's how every single scheme in this video operates. Early money comes from late money. Always has, always will. The genius of BitConnect wasn't the technology, it was the marketing. The platform recruited a small army of YouTube influencers who posted daily videos, flashing dashboards full of green numbers, telling their audiences this was the future of finance. Many testimonials were fabricated. Some featured paid actors reading scripts, and YouTube's algorithm promoted the highest engagement content straight to the top. So the more people talked about BitConnect, the more people invested in BitConnect. A self-reinforcing hype machine that Charles Ponzi could only dream of. At its peak, somewhere between 2 and 3 million users were on the platform. The BitConnect token hit a market cap of approximately $2.6 billion in January 2018. Then, on January 17th, following cease and desist orders from state regulators, the whole thing evaporated. The token crashed over 90% in a single day, which is, not ideal. Here's the thing. They tried to come back. BitConnect 2.0 was announced almost immediately after the shutdown because apparently the first catastrophic collapse wasn't embarrassing enough. But zoom out for a second. In 1920, Charles Ponzi used newspaper hype and word of mouth to convince 40,000 people to hand over their savings. In 2018, BitConnect used algorithm-boosted YouTube testimonials to convince millions to do the exact same thing. The technology changed completely. The psychology didn't change at all. People want to believe that easy money exists, and there will always be someone willing to sell them that belief. Not every story has a neat moral, but if this video has one, it's probably this. If someone promises you guaranteed returns and can't explain how, run fast in any direction. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.